Thank you, Dr. Green, for that nice introduction. I'm delighted to be here. Being at a Christian liberal arts college myself was an utterly transformative experience, and so I always welcome the chance to come back to venues like this. When I went off to graduate school many more years ago than I care to tally, my fondest hope and my highest aspiration was to teach at a place like Gordon College or Westmont College. I might even have considered Wheaton College, although not without a whole lot of soul searching before I would accept an offer of that sort. No offer came, and as Anne Lamott says, if you want to make God laugh, tell her your plans. And my career went in a different direction, a different trajectory. I first became interested in Jimmy Carter when I was an undergraduate at Trinity College. In the early 1970s, Jimmy Carter was just then moving on to the national scene. And what arrested me was, in part, his unabashed declaration that he was a born-again evangelical Christian, which, of course, is the language we use to describe ourselves. But what was striking to me about that is that he didn't seem ashamed or abashed about this. He said it as a point of pride, and that certainly caught my attention. And so over the years, I've sought to follow the career of Jimmy Carter, most recently in publishing this book, a biography of Jimmy Carter that tries to take seriously his faith because he took his faith seriously. And so in the next few minutes, I'm going to try to make you care about Jimmy Carter. It may be a tough task, but I will try to do that. Jimmy Carter was born on October 1st, 1924, which means that a month ago, he celebrated his 91st birthday. He was the first American president born in a hospital. His mother, Lillian Carter, was a kind of itinerant nurse, and so she had access to medical facilities that many other people in that community in southwestern Georgia did not. Jimmy Carter and his family moved about 3 miles from Plains, Georgia, down the road to Archery, Georgia, when he was 3 years old. This was a farm. Jimmy Carter worked very hard on the farm, doing chores every day, and he recalls it as a good childhood. He didn't know that he was probably poor by the standards of most of the world, but he often said, in fact, that many of the people around him were less prosperous than their family. Nevertheless, the farmhouse did not have electricity or indoor plumbing. Jimmy Carter was oblivious to this. It didn't matter to him at all. At the age of 11, in 1935, Jimmy Carter responded to a preacher's invitation, came forward and gave his life to Jesus, was a born-again Christian. Shortly thereafter, he was baptized into the Plains Baptist Church in 1935 in Plains, Georgia. He attended Plains High School, very often walking to school barefoot. He was a country boy, but nevertheless, he studied very hard. One of his favorite teachers was a woman named Julia Coleman, who often said that, who knows, maybe somebody here in our Plains schools might someday be President of the United States. And young Jimmy Carter was listening as she made that statement, that declaration. Miss Coleman went to the Chautauqua Institution in upstate New York every summer, came back one summer and decided that she would start a book club modeled on the Chautauqua Book Club, which claims to be the oldest book club in the nation. And she challenged her student, young Jimmy Carter, to read Leo Tolstoy's War and Peace, all 1,400 or so pages of this. Jimmy Carter, thinking that it was a book about cowboys and Indians, took the book out from the library, began reading it, and in fact finished the entire book. He studied hard, and when he graduated, he waited a couple of years, but then was admitted finally to the U.S. military, or the Naval Academy rather, in Annapolis, Maryland. Jimmy Carter decides to marry a woman from his hometown, Rosalind Smith, shortly after he graduates from Annapolis. This was considered a mixed marriage back in Plains because Jimmy Carter was, of course, a Southern Baptist, and Rosalind Smith was a Methodist. Nevertheless, they worked it out in favor of the Southern Baptists and joined the Plains Baptist Church. Jimmy Carter then embarked on his career as an ensign in the U.S. Navy. And in 1953, when the Carters were stationed in Schenectady, New York, Jimmy Carter was summoned back to Plains to stand at his father's bedside as his father was dying at the age of 53. As Jimmy Carter stood by his father's bedside, he began to hear all of these stories about small, discreet acts of kindness that Jimmy Carter's father, known as Mr. Earl in the community, had bestowed on members of the community. The time, for example, he bought new clothes for a poor family so they could attend their daughter's graduation from high school with at least a measure of pride. When he carried mortgages for other members of the community during times of financial stringency, and when he extended credit from the Carter warehouse and Carter store to those who needed financial assistance at any given time. And as Jimmy Carter was listening to these people talk about the influence that his father had had on the community, he decided that he wanted to have that same sort of influence within the community. So when he headed back to Schenectady after his father passed away, he announced to Rosalind that he was going to resign his commission in the Navy and move back to Plains, Georgia. Rosalind was not amused by this. She rather liked being a Navy wife with all the travel and all the different places they lived, including Hawaii and other places. And apparently, at this time in their lives, the word divorce cropped up into their conversations between these two very strong-willed individuals, Jimmy and Rosalind Carter. And the car trip from Schenectady, New York, back to southwestern Georgia apparently transpired in almost total silence between these two very strong individuals. Nevertheless, they settled back into Plains. Jimmy Carter became active in the business, and the business began turning a profit when Rosalind starts keeping the books, allowing Jimmy to be more active in the business affairs. And Jimmy starts to invest his time and efforts into the community as a member of the school board and then also as a candidate for public office. On the morning of his 38th birthday, October 1st, 1962, Jimmy Carter got out of bed, put on his Sunday trousers rather than his workaday trousers, and announced to Rosalind that he was heading to Americus to file papers to run for the Georgia State Senate. This is the first that Rosalind had ever heard about his political ambitions, and when I talked to Carter about this, he said, "I really can't believe I did this without consulting with Rosalind first," but nevertheless, that's what he did on that morning in 1962. He ran for the Democratic nomination for the Georgia State Senate and very nearly lost that primary election to another candidate who was the favorite of a political boss in Quitman County. Turns out in Quitman County on election day, the political boss, who was the sheriff, a guy by the name of Joe Hurst, decided that somebody else should be the Democratic nominee from that district, and he mounted an extraordinary get-out-the-vote effort in order to elect Herman Moore over Jimmy Carter. Turns out that out of 300 or so registered voters in Quitman County, more than 400 showed up to vote for Jimmy Carter's opponent in that primary election, many of them alphabetically down to the second and third letters of their last name. It was an extraordinary moment in political turnout, the envy of any political party, I'm sure. Well, Carter gets wind of this on election day. He goes to Quitman County, witnesses all these abuses, and decides that he's going to fight this, which he did successfully over the course of several weeks, and finally takes his seat as Georgia State Senator in January of 1963. In 1966, Jimmy Carter decides to run for governor of Georgia. Again, mounts a very energetic campaign. He loses 22 pounds in the course of this campaign because he's flitting all over the state in order to win voters. And on election day, he loses to, of all people, one of the South's most notorious segregationists, Lester G. Maddox. This was devastating for Jimmy Carter. Lester Maddox had come into prominence on the day after Lyndon Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act of 1964. That following day, Lester Maddox, who was owner of a restaurant in Atlanta called the Pickrick Restaurant, intercepted 3 young African-American men as they were coming across the parking lot to try to integrate his restaurant there in Atlanta. He met them with an axe handle and threatened them if they decided to try to integrate his restaurant. This made Maddox into a celebrity, and he rode that celebrity to the governor's mansion in 1966. Jimmy Carter returned to Plains after that election, utterly defeated, demoralized. Friends and family talk about seeing him walking through the fields or around town in Plains, utterly disconsolate. Here he had given all these efforts into winning election as governor in 1966, and he had lost to this arch segregationist. It's at this time that Jimmy Carter has a religious experience. One of his siblings, his sister, Ruth Carter Stapleton, was a Pentecostal evangelist. And Ruth came back to Plains to try to comfort her brother. They talk a good bit about the Christian faith. And Jimmy Carter decides to really rededicate his life to Jesus. This is my language, not his. Southern Baptists have different ways of describing this. But he rededicates his life to Jesus. And this turns out to be a transformative moment in his life and in his political career. Several weeks later, he embarks on a mission trip to Lock Haven, Pennsylvania, with other Southern Baptist laymen, where they go around the town literally knocking on doors to tell others about Jesus. The first time I met Carter actually was at an event at Emory University, a small group, and what he wanted to talk about at that event was what he called the unsurpassable joy of telling others about Christ. Later that same year, he goes on a second mission trip, this time to Springfield, Massachusetts. There he's teamed with a Puerto Rican minister by the name of Eloy Cruz, and they go around to Spanish-speaking neighborhoods in Springfield, and Jimmy Carter, with his rudimentary command of Spanish, reads from the Bible, and then Eloy Cruz would then preach to these families and try to invite them to give their hearts to Jesus. At the end of the week, Carter asks Cruz, he says, "Why is it that you're successful? Why do people respond so willingly and so readily to your preaching?" And Cruz didn't want to answer the question because he thought that Carter was superior to him. But Carter kept pushing him. And finally he said, "Senior Jimmy, the secret to the Christian life is to have two loves in your life. One for God and the other for whatever person happens to be standing in front of you at any given moment." And Jimmy Carter has talked about this time and time again throughout his political career and even beyond as being a formative moment in his understanding of the faith. 1970, Jimmy Carter mounts a second campaign for governor of Georgia. This time he is successful in winning the governor's mansion and is inaugurated on January 12, 1971. Shortly thereafter, he's recognized by the press as a new breed of governor, a so-called New South governor, that is a post-segregationist governor. In his inaugural address, he memorably announced that the time for racial segregation is over. And this was picked up by the New York Times the following day on the front page. And then several weeks later, Jimmy Carter's face appears on the cover of Time magazine, mentioned as a New South governor along with several other governors, Dale Bumpers of Arkansas and Reuben Askew of Florida. What's happening at this time in American history is very interesting to me, American religious history, and I want to take a moment to divert away from Jimmy Carter and talk a little bit about this. In the early part of the 1970s, there is a movement or a resurgence of a movement in American evangelicalism that I call progressive evangelicals. Progressive evangelicals in the 19th century had been remarkably active in social reform. They were active in the abolitionist movement, trying to eradicate the scourge of slavery. They were active in public education, what was known at the time as common schools, as a way for those on the lower rungs of society to become upwardly mobile and to join the middle class. They were active in the temperance movement. We think of the temperance movement today as being a kind of paternalistic movement. But in the 19th century, alcohol abuse was a serious, serious issue. And evangelicals, together with other Americans, sought to stem the abuse of alcohol and its attendant problems, including spousal abuse and child abuse and so forth. Evangelicals were also active in various peace movements, and they also advocated for equality for women, including voting rights, which in the 19th century was considered a rather radical movement. What happens in the early 1970s during the final years of the Vietnam War is that there's a gathering of 55 evangelical leaders at the YMCA in Chicago in November of 1973. And together they hammer out a document called the Chicago Declaration of Evangelical Social Concern. And this is a document that remarkably echoes many of the same concerns of 19th century evangelicals. For example, they decry the persistence of racism in American society. They talk about excessive militarism in American society. This, of course, was in the waning years of the Vietnam War. They talk about the growing gap between rich and poor, the tragedy, the scandal, that even in a society of such affluence, there are people who go to bed hungry every night. And finally, they reasserted the equal rights issue for women. And this document is, I think, a remarkable document. By the way, you can look at it for yourself. It's online, very easily accessible. The 1973 document called the Chicago Declaration of Evangelical Social Concern. And what I argue is that Jimmy Carter, as he begins to run for president, actually just the following year, builds on some of these same themes that are articulated by progressive evangelicals in November of 1973. In fact, less than 6 months after the Chicago Declaration was hammered out, there's a gathering of law students at the University of Georgia Law School in Athens, Georgia, which is called Law Day. This is a time when graduating students invite various celebrities to come and address them before they graduate. So typically they invite U.S. senators or Supreme Court justices or attorneys general or whoever it might be to come and be part of this big event in Athens, Georgia. And in May of 1974, the keynote speaker was the senior senator from Massachusetts. You may have heard of him, Edward Moore Kennedy. He gave the address. And then after that, the undercard speaker was the governor of Georgia, Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter got up before this gathering and began talking about his understanding of justice. Where did his understanding of justice come? And he said, where did it come from, pardon me? He said he had two theologians who had influenced his thinking about justice. The first was Reinhold Niebuhr and his famous dictum that the sad duty of politics was to establish justice in a sinful world. And Jimmy Carter has talked about this and quoted this many times over the course of his career. His second understanding of justice came from the venerable theologian Bob Dylan, particularly Dylan's song, Ain't Gonna Work on Maggie's Farm No More, which talks about the plight of tenant farmers. This, he said, had shaped his own understanding of justice. And he went on to talk about what he'd been doing as governor of Georgia in order to try to bring justice to the judicial system, for example, noting that the preponderance of inmates in Georgia state prisons were people of color, people who could not afford adequate legal representation, and so forth. And then he finished his remarks by talking about the corruptions in Washington. At that time, the Watergate scandal was in full bloom. And also, he talked about how regulatory agencies in Washington very often were staffed with industry representatives of the same industries that they were supposed to be regulating. In the midst of his remarks, Jimmy Carter noticed one of the journalists slip out of the room briefly and then return a few minutes later. Initially, he thought that Hunter S. Thompson, the self-proclaimed gonzo journalist of Rolling Stone magazine, was going out simply to refresh whatever adult beverage he was consuming that day. But it turns out that Hunter Thompson was going to get his tape recorder to record something extraordinary, as he later said. A politician willing to tell the truth, willing to speak truth to power. And he thought that Jimmy Carter was an example of that, a really extraordinary example of that. Jimmy Carter then embarks on his campaign for president of the United States. Later that same year, in 1974, he goes to the precincts of Iowa and then also to the small towns in New Hampshire and is able to boost his way toward the Democratic nomination in early 1976. Jimmy Carter, I think, is not sufficiently appreciated for his great contribution to American politics, and that is that he effectively ended the political career of the nation's most notorious segregationist, George C. Wallace of Alabama, by beating Wallace in the Florida primary in March of 1976, thereby effectively ending George Wallace's political career. And Jimmy Carter, a fellow Southerner, had done that. I don't think he gets enough credit for having done that. Jimmy Carter then wins the Democratic nomination in July of 1976 and moves on toward the general election. He's leading the polls. He's looking at a landslide going into the final weeks of the campaign. And then, as some people in this room will remember, on September 21st of 1976, a magazine appears on the newsstand containing an interview with Jimmy Carter. That magazine is Playboy magazine, and in that interview, Jimmy Carter acknowledges that he had looked on women other than his wife with lust. Now, for evangelicals, that's an utterly unremarkable statement, right? What did Jesus say in the Sermon on the Mount? Jesus said, "You have heard it said, 'Thou shalt not kill.' But I tell you, if you look on your brother with hatred, it is as though you had killed him. Similarly," he says, "you shall have heard it said, 'Thou shalt not commit adultery.' But I tell you, if you look on a woman other than your wife with lust, it is as though you had committed adultery." So there's nothing unusual about this. But the press picked this up. My favorite editorial cartoon shows Jimmy Carter looking at the Statue of Liberty in a state of undress and so forth. It's just, everything just goes crazy. Jimmy Carter loses 15% in the polls in the course of that, the final weeks of that campaign, on the heels of the Playboy interview, and barely ekes out a win in his race against Gerald Ford for the presidency in November of 1976. Jimmy Carter is inaugurated president on January 20th, 1977, and his first official act as president is to offer a pardon to Vietnam War-era draft resistors, trying to put behind us that long and divisive period in American history. He also recognizes, as part of his quest for a moral presidency, that if the United States is to have any meaningful relationship with Latin American nations, or more generally with third world nations, we had to renegotiate the Panama Canal treaties. And he expended a great deal of political capital early in his presidency in order to do that. He also recognized that American foreign policy needed to move away from the reflexive dualism of the Cold War era toward an emphasis on human rights. And human rights is now part of American foreign policy discourse, part of our considerations as we consider our relationship with other nations. Jimmy Carter also expended a great deal of political capital in negotiating the Camp David Accords between Menachem Begin of Israel and Anwar el-Sadat of Egypt. And if you've read Lawrence Wright's recent book on this, 13 Days in September, you will understand how difficult that was and how Jimmy Carter really virtually gambled his presidency on his ability to win these Camp David Accords, which he thought were morally important. Jimmy Carter also appointed more women and minorities to office than any other president before him. He worked very hard for the Equal Rights Amendment, again, very much in consonance with progressive evangelicalism back in the 19th century, and also as represented in the Chicago Declaration of Evangelical Social Concern. So he tried very hard to conduct what he thought of as a moral presidency. Nevertheless, many of the same people, evangelicals, who had helped propel Jimmy Carter to office in 1976, turned dramatically against him 4 years later in favor of Ronald Reagan. And I want to take a moment to talk a little bit about this. The standard narrative for the understanding of the rise of the religious right was that it was a direct response to the Roe v. Wade decision by the Supreme Court on January 22nd, 1973. According to this narrative, evangelicals were so morally outraged by the Supreme Court decision that they decided to mobilize politically for really the first time in several decades in order to reverse that abomination coming down from the Supreme Court. Some leaders of the religious right, Jerry Falwell, Pat Robertson, and others, have even gone so far as to characterize themselves as the so-called new abolitionists, trying to draw a parallel between their opposition to abortion and the opposition of antebellum evangelicals to the scourge of slavery. It is a great story, and it is also utter fiction. I want to be clear about this. I'm not taking a position on abortion one way or another. I'm happy to do that if you want me to do that at some point. I'm willing to talk about that issue. But I want to point out what the real genesis of the religious right was. Going back to the late 1960s, Christianity Today magazine and a group called the Christian Medical Society had a conference in 1969 to talk about the moral and ethical issues surrounding abortion. They published their findings. I expect the Gordon Library has a copy of that book, and you can look at it for yourself. But if you look at the conclusion, they decide we can't really determine what the proper evangelical moral position is on abortion, but we think it probably should be allowed in many cases. In 1971, the Southern Baptist Convention, meeting in St. Louis, Missouri, passed a resolution calling for the legalization of abortion. That same Southern Baptist Convention, not exactly a redoubt of liberalism, reaffirmed that resolution in 1974 and again in 1976. When the Roe v. Wade decision was handed down from the Supreme Court, W.A. Criswell of Dallas, Texas, pastor of First Baptist Church, Dallas, Texas, the largest Baptist church in the world, one of the most famous fundamentalists of the 20th century, issued a statement applauding the Roe v. Wade decision as marking an appropriate distinction between personal morality and public policy. My purpose in saying this is not, again, not to take a position one way or another on the issue, merely to point out that when you hear leaders of the religious right saying that abortion is what got them motivated politically, they're not telling the truth, to be quite honest. What happened? The real story is rather more complicated. The real story goes back to Lyndon Johnson signing the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Title VI of that act provides that no public institution shall engage in racial segregation. Several years later, down in Holmes County, Mississippi, a group of parents filed suit against several Christian schools, so-called segregation academies, that had come into being as a way to thwart the desegregation of public schools there in Holmes County, Mississippi. The first year of desegregation in Holmes County, the number of students, white students in the public schools, dropped from something like, don't quote me on the numbers, but something like 430 to 28. The second year of desegregation, the number of white students dropped to 0. At the same time, several so-called segregation academies, many of them church-sponsored, had filed for tax-exempt status with the Internal Revenue Service. And these parents banded together and filed suit to stop the granting of tax-exempt status to these segregated institutions. On June 30th, 1971, the District Court, the District of Columbia, upheld the IRS in its refusal to grant tax exemption to racially segregated institutions. And in the ensuing years, the IRS then sent questionnaires, actually in ensuing months to that ruling, sent questionnaires to schools around the country to ask them about their racial policies. One of those questionnaires landed on the desk of Bob Jones Jr. of Bob Jones University in Greenville, South Carolina, to ask about their racial policies. Bob Jones Jr., of course, replied, yes, we segregate. We believe the Bible tells us to segregate, and we don't plan to change our position. And what happened is, I'm condensing the process quite a bit here. What happened is that after years of warning, finally on January 19th, 1976, the IRS rescinded the tax exemption of Bob Jones University. That was the catalyst for the religious right. It was not the Roe v. Wade ruling of 1973. Paul Weyrich, who's the architect of the religious right, told me this directly and confirmed this story. I won't get into all the details, but we had a conversation about this, and he said, ever since the Goldwater campaign of 1964, I'd been trying to get evangelicals interested in politics. He said, I tried everything. I tried the school prayer issue, I tried abortion, I tried pornography issue, I tried the Equal Rights Amendment. Nothing got them interested until the school issue came along with the Bob Jones case in 1976. That is what got evangelicals interested in politics. Abortion came into the equation later, and again, I'm going to abbreviate the story here very, very quickly by saying that in 1979, there was a film series that featured two individuals, Francis A. Schaeffer, arguably the intellectual godfather of the religious right, and C. Everett Koop, a pediatric surgeon. This film series was called Whatever Happened to the Human Race, and this is what got evangelicals interested in the political process, and abortion in particular, in the late 1980s, not in direct response to the Roe v. Wade ruling of 1973. What happens for Jimmy Carter is Jimmy Carter, of course, is president as this is happening in the late 1970s, and evangelicals turn radically against him in 1980, and he is defeated for re-election, not only because of evangelicals, there were other things going on as well, but that contributed to his defeat in 1980. Jimmy Carter might have gone back to Plains, and in fact did go back to Plains, angry, embittered, utterly discouraged by his devastating electoral loss in 1980. And in fact, when we talked about this, he said, I asked him how he had recovered so quickly from the 1980 defeat. And he said that Rosalind was so angry and embittered by it that he kept reassuring her that they had a life together and they could still do good things in the world. And after a while, he began to believe his own rhetoric, is what he told me, because he was trying to reassure his wife after that defeat. Shortly thereafter, he starts the Carter Center. The Carter Center has been a remarkable beacon of humanitarian hope around the world, monitoring elections, staving off military confrontations, also remarkably effective in eliminating several tropical diseases, all because Jimmy Carter decided to do this, to act on his best evangelical and moral impulses. For years, I've been talking about how I believe that religion functions best on the margins of society and not in the councils of power. Once religious individuals, people of faith, begin to aspire after political power, they lose, I believe, their prophetic voice. And I think Jimmy Carter's career illustrates that very, very well. Jimmy Carter was successful in many of the things he did as president, although his presidency is not often seen as an overall success, and I'm not prepared to quarrel with that assessment. I think it's more complicated than it's usually rendered, but nevertheless, I understand that assessment. But to me, his real contributions have been since he left political office, since he didn't have to worry any longer about courting political power or running for re-election. And since leaving the White House in 1981, Jimmy Carter has left a remarkable stamp on the world through his humanitarian efforts, which were, of course, acknowledged by his winning of the Nobel Peace Prize in 2002. My favorite quote about Jimmy Carter comes from James Laney, the former president of Emory University, who said about Jimmy Carter, he's the only person in history for whom the presidency was a stepping stone. And I think it captures very nicely what Jimmy Carter has done since leaving office in 1981 in terms of making the world a better place. As some of you know, I'm sure most of you have heard, Jimmy Carter was recently diagnosed with brain cancer. He's 91 years old, so he's had a good run, and he said that as much when that announcement was made. But if you look back on his career, I think you see a remarkable individual who has sought throughout his life to act on his evangelical impulses, to try to build a moral presidency, but even more, after leaving office to leave his moral mark on the world, and I believe he has done so. Thank you for your time.